The mountain man stood in the doorway of the general store, with blood seeping through his leather vest, and the woman behind the counter did not scream. Judith Brennan had seen worse in her 22 years, especially in the 6 months since she had taken over running her late uncle's store in Silver Ridge, Montana territory in the year 1876. The town sat nestled in a valley between imposing peaks that turned purple at sunset, and it attracted every manner of rough character seeking fortune in the nearby mines or escape from whatever sins they had committed elsewhere. This particular man, however, looked like he had crawled out of the mountains themselves. He was massive, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the doorframe. His hair hung past his shoulders in dark waves, tangled with bits of pine needles and what might have been dried blood. His beard was thick and unkempt, and his clothes were a mixture of buckskin and furs that had seen better days, maybe better years. "You hurt bad?" Judith asked, setting down the ledger she had been working on. Her voice was steady, practical. She had learned early that panic solved nothing. The man blinked at her, his eyes a startling shade of gray like storm clouds over the mountains. He swayed slightly, catching himself on the doorframe with a hand that could probably crush a man's skull. "Ain't—" He paused, seeming to remember something, then corrected himself. "Is not as bad as it looks. Just need some whiskey and bandages if you got them." Judith came around the counter, her practical brown skirts swishing. She was a tall woman herself, nearly 5'9", with auburn hair pulled back in a sensible bun and green eyes that missed very little. "Sit before you fall," she commanded, pointing to a chair near the potbelly stove. The mountain man obeyed with surprising docility for someone so large and clearly capable of violence. Up close, Judith could see that despite the rough exterior, he could not have been more than 30 years old, maybe younger under all that facial hair. The wound was a gash along his ribs, probably from a knife or a sharp branch, and it needed cleaning and stitching. "I've got medical supplies in the back," she said. "Take off that vest." He did as instructed, his massive hands working at the leather ties. When he pulled the vest away, Judith had to force herself to focus on the wound and not on the extraordinary musculature revealed beneath. The man was built like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, all hard plains and powerful curves. Scars crisscrossed his torso, telling stories of a hard life lived on the edge of civilization. She returned with her medical kit, a bottle of whiskey, and a basin of clean water. "This will hurt," she warned. "Most things do," he replied, and there was something in his voice, a weariness that spoke of more than physical pain. Judith worked efficiently, cleaning the wound with whiskey-soaked cloth. To his credit, the mountain man barely flinched, though she felt his muscles tense under her hands. "You have got a name?" she asked as she threaded a needle. "Jonas," he said. Then he extended his hand in an awkward gesture that seemed to surprise even him. "Jonas Crow. Sorry for the mess I'm tracking in." She shook his hand, noting the calluses and the strength in his grip that he carefully moderated. "Judith Brennan, and I have seen worse messes." She began stitching, her hands steady and sure. "What happened?" "Disagreement with a prospector up in the high country," Jonas said. "He thought a beaver trap line I had been running for 3 years was suddenly his. Got aggressive about it. I hope you left him alive." "I did. Tied him up and left him at the sheriff's office in Coppertown before I rode here." Jonas watched her work with those unsettling gray eyes. "You were good at that." "My uncle taught me. He said a woman running a store in a place like this needed to know how to patch up fools who got themselves hurt." She tied off the last stitch with practiced efficiency. "That uncle is dead now, 6 months back. Heart gave out, left me the store. Sorry for your loss." "Thank you." Judith began bandaging the wound with clean strips of cloth. "That will hold if you do not do anything stupid like get in another fight or try to wrestle a bear." Jonas's lips twitched beneath his beard. It might have been the start of a smile. "I will endeavor to avoid bears." "Good." She stood and began cleaning up her supplies. "That will be $2 for the medical supplies and the whiskey." He fished coins from a leather pouch at his belt and placed them on the counter. Then he stood, carefully pulling his shirt and vest back on. He was even more imposing on his feet, and Judith found herself having to look up to meet his eyes, which was a novel experience. "Thank you," Jonas said. He hesitated, then extended his hand again. "Jonas Crow, pleased to make your acquaintance." Judith stared at him for a moment, then felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in her chest. It had been months since she had genuinely laughed, not since before Uncle Thomas died and left her alone in this rough town with a business to run and creditors to satisfy and miners who thought a woman alone was an invitation. But something about this massive, dangerous-looking man forgetting that he had already introduced himself just moments ago struck her as impossibly endearing. The laugh escaped, bright and genuine, and she shook his hand again. "We already did that part, Jonas Crow." He blinked, then looked down at their clasped hands, and a flush actually crept up his neck into his bearded cheeks. "Right, I did. Sorry. I'm not—" He trailed off, seeming at a loss. That was when Judith felt something shift in her chest, something she had not felt in the long years of caring for her aging uncle, and then struggling to survive in his wake. This massive, scarred mountain man who could probably kill with his bare hands was blushing, because he had forgotten he had already introduced himself, and she found it absolutely charming. Jonas must have seen something change in her expression, because his own face transformed. The wariness melted away, replaced by something almost like wonder. He did not let go of her hand. "Would you like some coffee?" Judith heard herself ask. "I was about to make some anyway." "I would," Jonas said, "if it is not too much trouble." "No trouble at all." That was how it started. On an autumn afternoon in 1876 in Silver Ridge, Montana territory, with blood and whiskey and a laugh over a twice-given introduction. Jonas Crow sat at Judith Brennan's table in the back room of her store and drank coffee that she made too strong, and they talked until the sun set behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. He told her about his life in the high country, about trap lines and tracking game in the profound silence of winter snow. She told him about growing up in St. Louis, about the steamboats on the Mississippi, and the decision to come west to help her uncle when he wrote that he was ailing. They discovered they were both readers, that Jonas had a small collection of books in his cabin that he read and reread through the long winters. She loved Shakespeare. He preferred the adventure novels of James Fenimore Cooper. "I should go," Jonas finally said when full dark had fallen. "You have probably got things to do." "Probably," Judith agreed, but neither of them moved. "Could I come back?" The question came out awkward, almost shy. "I come to town maybe once a month for supplies. Could I stop by?" "I would like that," Judith said, and meant it with a fierceness that surprised her. Jonas stood, and the room seemed smaller with him in it. He looked at her for a long moment, and she wondered what he saw. She was no great beauty, she knew. Her face was too strong-featured, her body too tall and angular. She had capable hands and a practical disposition, and most men found her intimidating or simply uninteresting. But Jonas looked at her like she was something precious. "Good night, Judith Brennan," he said softly. "Good night, Jonas Crow." She watched him leave, his massive frame silhouetted against the moonlight, and pressed her hand to her chest, where her heart was beating harder than it had in years. The next weeks passed in the usual rhythm of frontier life. Judith ran her store, negotiated with suppliers, extended credit she probably should not have, to miners who swore their claims were about to pay out, and dealt with the occasional drunk who thought she might be as available as the girls at the saloon down the street. She'd gotten good at disabusing people of that notion, usually with the rifle she kept under the counter and a spine of pure steel. But now there was something else, a bright thread of anticipation woven through the ordinary days. Jonas had said he came to town once a month. It had been 2 weeks since she had stitched him up. She found herself listening for his voice, watching the door. She told herself she was being foolish. He was a mountain man, probably half wild, certainly dangerous. They had talked for one evening. That was all. He might not come back. He might have forgotten all about her, but she remembered the way he had looked at her, and she did not think he was the forgetting type, not about things that mattered. 3 weeks after their first meeting, the bell above the store door chimed, and Jonas Crow walked in. He had cleaned up. His hair was still long, but now neatly combed and tied back, his beard trimmed. He wore a clean shirt under his leather vest, and he was carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Miss Brennan," he said, and his voice did something to her insides. "Mr. Crow," she replied, trying to sound professional while her heart hammered. "What can I do for you today?" "I need supplies," he said, then added, "and I brought you something." He set the cloth-wrapped bundle on the counter and carefully unwrapped it, revealing a haunch of venison, fresh and neatly butchered. "Took a buck yesterday. Thought you might have use for it." Judith stared at the meat, then at Jonas. It was a generous gift and a meaningful one. Fresh meat was always welcome, especially good venison. But more than that, it was a statement. He had been thinking of her. He had taken time to prepare this and carry it down from his mountain. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "That is very kind." "It is no trouble." He shifted his weight, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "I was wondering if maybe after you close up today, you might have dinner with me. There is a restaurant, the one run by Mrs. Chen. I hear she cooks good." "Very good," Judith confirmed. Mrs. Chen was a Chinese immigrant who had come to Silver Ridge with her husband to work in the mines, and when he died in a collapse, she had started a restaurant that served food better than anything else within 100 miles. "I would like that very much." The smile that broke across Jonas's face was like sunrise over the mountains. They had dinner that evening at Mrs. Chen's small establishment, sitting at a corner table while the older woman served them dishes that married Chinese cooking techniques with available ingredients. Venison, stir-fried with wild onions, potatoes fried crisp and seasoned with mysterious spices, and rice that was a luxury in these parts. Jonas ate with surprising manners for a mountain man, and he asked Judith questions about her life, her dreams, what she wanted for her future. No one had asked her those things in longer than she could remember. "I want the store to succeed," she said, surprising herself with her honesty. "I want to prove I can do this, that I can make something of what Uncle Thomas left me, and She hesitated, then pushed forward. "I want not to be alone all the time. It gets quiet." Jonas nodded slowly. "I know about quiet. Sometimes the silence in the mountains is so big it feels like you might disappear into it." He looked at her with those storm-gray eyes. "But then other times, the silence is good, peaceful. It depends on whether you are alone by choice or by circumstance." "Which is it for you?" Judith asked. "It was by choice," Jonas said. "I came out here 10 years ago after my family died. Cholera epidemic in Kansas City took my parents and my 2 sisters. I was 20 years old, and I could not stand to be in that city anymore, seeing the places they had been, remembering. So I came to the mountains and learned to trap and hunt and be alone." "I am sorry," Judith said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. "That's a terrible loss." His hand turned under hers, his fingers curling around hers. "Thank you. It was a long time ago, but being alone, it became a habit. Now I'm not sure I remember how to be any other way." "You are doing fine right now," Judith said. They sat there holding hands across the table while Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly from her kitchen and the lamps flickered against the growing dark outside. Jonas started coming to town every week instead of every month. He always brought something, fresh game, or fish from the cold mountain streams, or once a honeycomb he had carefully harvested, the honey golden and rich. Judith looked forward to his visits with an intensity that should have frightened her, but instead felt like coming alive after a long sleep. They fell into a pattern. Jonas would arrive in the afternoon, help Judith with any heavy work that needed doing around the store, then they would have dinner together, either at Mrs. Chen's or in Judith's quarters above the store where she would cook the game he brought. Afterward, they would sit and talk for hours, or sometimes Jonas would read aloud from books in his deep, rumbling voice while Judith mended clothes or worked on her ledgers. He told her about the mountains, about tracking through snow and reading signs in the forest, about the moment at dawn when the world seemed to hold its breath before the sun broke over the peaks. She told him about her childhood, about her mother who had died when she was 12, and her father who had drunk himself to death 2 years later, about the uncle who had taken her in and taught her to be strong and practical and independent. "He sounds like he was a good man," Jonas said one evening. They were in Judith's sitting room, a fire crackling in the small stove. Jonas sat in the chair that had been Uncle Thomas's, and he fitted better than her uncle ever had, his large frame filling the space naturally. "He was," Judith agreed. She was working on repairing a shirt, her needle flashing in the lamplight. Gruff and crusty on the outside, but kind underneath. He never married, never had children of his own. I think he was glad to have me, even though I came to him half wild with grief and anger. "You are not angry now," Jonas observed. "No." Judith looked up from her sewing, meeting his eyes. "I am not." The air between them felt charged, heavy with things unspoken. Jonas set down the book he had been holding and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Judith, I need to tell you something." Her heart stuttered. "All right. I'm not good with words. Never have been. 10 years in the mountains did not improve that any." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as nervousness. "But I need you to know that these past weeks, coming here, seeing you, it has been the best thing in my life for longer than I can remember. You are the best thing." Judith set down her sewing with careful precision, her hands suddenly shaking. "Jonas, I am falling in love with you," he said, the words coming out in a rush. "Maybe already have fallen, and I needed to say it, because I cannot keep coming here and pretending this is just friendly visits. It is not friendly. It is courting, at least on my part, and you deserve to know that." The room was so quiet, she could hear the pop and crackle of the fire, the distant sound of someone playing a piano in the saloon down the street. Her heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy with it. "It is courting on my part, too," she said softly, "and I am falling in love with you as well. I think I started that first day when you introduced yourself twice, and I laughed." Jonas's expression transformed, hope and wonder, and something fierce and possessive all at once. He stood and crossed the small distance between them in 2 strides, then knelt beside her chair so they were eye to eye. "Can I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes," Judith breathed. He cupped her face in his large, calloused hands with surprising gentleness and kissed her. It was careful at first, almost chaste, but then Judith made a small sound in her throat and reached for him, her fingers tangling in his long hair, and the kiss deepened. It was like nothing she had ever experienced, heat and need and rightness all mixed together until she felt like she might burn up with it. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. "I do not have much," he said. "A cabin in the mountains, my trap lines, some savings. But I am a hard worker, and I can provide. I can keep you safe. I can love you for the rest of my life if you will let me." "Yes," Judith said, and kissed him again. "Yes to all of it." They sat together by the fire, Judith in her chair and Jonas on the floor beside her with his head resting against her knee while she ran her fingers through his hair, and they planned a future. Jonas would keep his cabin and his trap lines, but he would spend more time in town with Judith. Eventually, maybe they would build a house between the town and the mountains, a place that belonged to both of them. He would help her with the store, and she would help him sell his furs and pelts for better prices than he had been getting from the trading post. "When?" Judith asked. "When should we marry?" "Tomorrow," Jonas said immediately, looking up at her with those intense gray eyes. "Tonight, if there was a preacher available." She laughed, the sound bubbling up joyous and free. "Give me at least a few weeks to prepare. I want a decent dress and we should have a proper celebration." "Anything you want," Jonas said, "as long as the end result is you being my wife." They were married 6 weeks later in the small church at the edge of town on a crisp November morning with fresh snow on the mountains. Judith wore a dress of deep green wool that matched her eyes, and she had splurged on lace for the collar and cuffs. Jonas wore new clothes for the occasion, black trousers and a white shirt and a vest of fine leather, and he had trimmed his beard short though his hair still hung past his shoulders. He looked magnificent and terrifying and completely devoted as he watched Judith walk down the aisle toward him. The ceremony was simple. Most of the town attended, curious about the strange match between the practical store owner and the wild mountain man. Mrs. Chen cried openly. The sheriff, a grizzled man named Porter who had known Uncle Thomas, gave Judith away with gruff ceremony. And when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Jonas kissed her with such tender passion that someone in the back pews whooped appreciatively. They held the reception in the store, which they had closed for the day. Mrs. Chen had cooked a feast, and people brought whiskey and beer and wild turkey in dishes made from whatever they had on hand. A miner named O'Connell played fiddle, and there was dancing in the cleared space between the shelves. Jonas danced with his bride despite claiming he did not know how, holding her carefully like she might break, and Judith laughed with pure joy as he spun her in slow circles. "Happy?" he murmured against her hair. "So happy I can barely stand it," she replied. As the sun set and the party continued, Jonas and Judith slipped away to the rooms above the store where Judith had lived alone for 6 months and would never be alone again. Jonas carried her over the threshold with an ease that made her feel delicate despite her height, and he set her down gently in the bedroom. "I should tell you," Judith said as Jonas carefully began unpinning her hair. "I've never done this before." His hand stilled. "Neither have I," he admitted. "Not properly. There was a woman once, years ago, but it was brief and not meaningful. This is different. You are different." "We will figure it out together," Judith said, and reached up to kiss him. They undressed each other slowly, learning the landscape of bodies by lamplight. Jonas was all hard muscle and scars, powerful and dangerous, and so careful with her that Judith wanted to weep with it. She was less confident about her own body, too angular and practical, but the way Jonas looked at her made her feel beautiful. "You are perfect," he breathed, running his hands over her skin like she was something precious. "You are everything." Their first time was awkward and sweet and intense, filled with whispered instructions and gentle encouragements and moments of laughter when something did not quite work as expected. But underlying it all was a connection so profound that Judith felt it in her bones. This was right. This was where she was supposed to be, in the arms of this man who had walked into her store bleeding and introduced himself twice. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Jonas's large frame curled protectively around Judith's. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I will love you until the mountains crumble." "I love you too," Judith replied. "My husband." She felt him smile against her shoulder. Winter came to Silver Ridge with a vengeance that year. Snow fell thick and heavy, transforming the town into something from a fairy tale, all white drifts and ice-laden pines. The store stayed busy as people stocked up on supplies to wait out the worst of the weather, and Jonas proved invaluable, hauling heavy loads and making deliveries to people snowed in at outlying claims. He moved between the mountains and the town with the ease of someone born to that life, checking his trap lines in the high country and bringing down furs that Judith sold for excellent prices. They had turned Uncle Thomas's old office into a space for processing pelts, and Jonas taught Judith the art of preparing furs properly, how to scrape and stretch and cure them until they were soft and valuable. "You have got a knack for this," Jonas said one afternoon as Judith worked on a beaver pelt. They were in the workroom, the air sharp with the smell of the solutions Jonas used to cure the hides. "Most people take months to learn what you picked up in weeks." "I have a good teacher," Judith replied, glancing up to smile at him. He was working on a deer hide, his powerful arms flexing as he worked the leather. Even after months of seeing him nearly every day, the sight of him still made her breath catch. Jonas caught her looking and grinned. "You are staring, wife." "Can you blame me?" He laughed and crossed to her, bending to kiss her soundly, despite the fact that they were both covered in bits of fur and smelled strongly of curing solution. "I am the luckiest man in Montana Territory," he declared. "Flattery will not get you out of cleaning this mess," Judith said, but she was smiling. That evening, after they had closed the store and cleaned up and eaten the stew Judith had made that morning, they sat together by the stove. Jonas was reading aloud from a collection of Poe stories they had acquired from a traveling salesman, his deep voice making the Gothic tales even more atmospheric. Judith was supposedly mending, but mostly she was just watching her husband and marveling at the turn her life had taken. A year ago, she had been alone and struggling, trying to run a business in a town that did not think a woman could manage it, grieving her uncle and wondering if she would spend the rest of her life in solitude. Now she had Jonas, and with him had come not just love, but partnership. He respected her intelligence and her capabilities. He asked her opinion on things and listened to her answers. He never tried to take over or push her aside, but he was always there, a solid presence at her back. "What are you thinking about?" Jonas asked, setting down the book. He had gotten good at reading her expressions. "How happy I am," Judith said honestly. "How different everything is from what I expected." Jonas held out his hand and she took it, letting him pull her from her chair into his lap. She settled against his broad chest, feeling his arms come around her, secure and warm. "I never thought I would have this," Jonas said quietly. "A wife, a home, someone to come back to. I thought I would grow old alone in my cabin and eventually not come down from the mountain one spring. I'd made my peace with that. And now? Now I have everything." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "You are everything, Judith." She turned in his arms to kiss him properly, and the mending was abandoned for the night. January brought a cold snap so severe that even old-timers said they had never seen the like. The temperature plunged far below zero and stayed there for a week straight. The store became a refuge for townsfolk who clustered around the big stove Jonas kept fed with wood, and Judith dispensed hot coffee and whatever food she could spare, while Jonas checked on the older residents to make sure they were surviving the cold. One morning, Jonas came back from his rounds with a grim expression. "What is wrong?" Judith asked immediately. "Old Samuel, the prospector who lives up canyon? His cabin caught fire, trying to keep warm, I think, and something went wrong with his stove." Jonas's jaw was tight. "He got out, but he lost everything. He's at the boarding house now, but he has no supplies, no money. He is too proud to ask for help." Judith did not hesitate. "Put together a box of essentials, food, blankets, whatever he needs. We will extend credit." "He cannot pay," Jonas said. "His claim never panned out. He is barely surviving as it is." "Then it is a gift." Jonas looked at her with such love and pride that Judith felt her cheeks flush. "You are a good woman, Judith Crow." "We help people when we can," Judith said firmly. "That is what Uncle Thomas did, and that is what we will do." They put together a generous box of supplies, and Jonas delivered it personally. When he returned, he told Judith that Samuel had cried, old tears freezing on his weathered cheeks. The town noticed. People always noticed everything in a small community, and word spread that the Crows were willing to help those who needed it. It brought a certain amount of goodwill that translated into loyalty. When traveling salesmen tried to undercut Judith's prices, people still shopped at her store. When a big outfit from Denver tried to establish a competing general store, the town collectively shrugged and kept giving the Crows their business. "You are building something here," Jonas observed one evening as they went over the ledgers together. "Not just a store, a place people trust." "We are building it," Judith corrected. "I could not do this without you." It was true. Jonas had become essential to the operation in ways she had not anticipated. His knowledge of the mountains and the people who lived in the high country had opened up new trade opportunities. Miners and trappers who had never come to town before started making the journey because they trusted Jonas, and his sheer physical presence meant that the rougher element thought twice before causing trouble. There was one incident in late February when 3 drifters came into the store clearly looking for trouble. They were drunk despite the early hour, and their leader, a mean-eyed man with a scar across his cheek, started making crude comments about Judith. Before Judith could reach for the rifle under the counter, Jonas emerged from the back room. He did not say anything at first, just stood there with his arms crossed over his massive chest, his gray eyes cold as winter ice. The drifters took one look at him and reconsidered their choices. "We are leaving," the scarred man muttered, and they stumbled out. Jonas waited until they were gone, then turned to Judith. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "You're very good at that." "At what?" "Looking terrifying." He grinned suddenly, the expression transforming his face. "I have had practice, though I am only terrifying to people who deserve it." "Good thing I do not deserve it then," Judith said. "Good thing," Jonas agreed, and pulled her close for a kiss that made her forget all about the drifters. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow retreating inch by inch up the slopes. The creek swelled with meltwater and the meadows turned green overnight. Jonas spent more time in the high country as the trapping season ended, and he checked the conditions of the trails, scouting for the best routes for the summer supply wagons. Judith missed him when he was gone, even though she understood the necessity. The store kept her busy, and she had made friends among the townswomen, particularly Mrs. Chen and a young mother named Elizabeth Harper, whose husband worked one of the more successful claims. But the nights alone were long, and she found herself listening for the sound of Jonas's horse, watching the mountain trails for signs of his return. He always came back, though. Sometimes he was gone for 3 days, sometimes for a week, but he always came back to her, usually bearing gifts from the mountains, the first wildflowers of spring, or interesting stones, or once an eagle feather that Judith treasured. "I hate leaving you," Jonas confessed one night after returning from a particularly long absence. They were in bed, wrapped around each other in the darkness. "The whole time I am up there, part of me is here with you." "I know," Judith said softly, "but I also know that the mountains are part of who you are. I would never ask you to give that up." "You are more important," Jonas said fiercely. "If you asked me to stay, I would." "I'm not asking," Judith said. "I'm telling you that I trust you to go and I trust you to come back. And that is enough." He made love to her then with an intensity that left them both breathless and shaking, and Judith felt the truth of their connection down to her soul. This was what partnership meant. This was what love meant. In May, Judith realized she had missed her monthly courses. She waited another week to be sure, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear, and then she told Jonas. He was in the workroom, repairing a harness for one of their horses, when Judith found him. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching him work, this man who had become her entire world. "Jonas," she said, "I need to tell you something." He looked up immediately, hearing something in her voice. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong." She crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "I think I am pregnant." Jonas went very still. His eyes searched her face, and she saw hope and wonder, and something like fear flash across his features. "You think?" "I'm almost certain. I've missed my courses and I feel different, tired but also full of energy, if that makes sense. And this morning the smell of bacon made me ill, which has never happened before." "A baby," Jonas said slowly, like he was testing the words. "We are going to have a baby." "Yes," Judith said. "Are you happy about it?" In answer, Jonas swept her up into his arms, spinning her around once before setting her down carefully, like she might break. His face was alight with joy. "Happy? Judith, I am terrified and amazed and happier than I have any right to be. A baby, our baby." Judith felt tears prick her eyes. "I was worried you might think it was too soon." "Too soon?" Jonas cupped her face in his hands. "We are married and in love and building a life together. How could this be too soon? This is everything. You are everything." He kissed her then, tender and sweet, and Judith felt the rightness of it settle into her bones. This was meant to be. This child was meant to be. The pregnancy progressed well through the summer. Judith continued running the store with Jonas's help, though he became almost comically protective, refusing to let her lift anything heavy and fussing if she looked tired. The town was excited about the coming baby, and Judith found herself the recipient of knitted blankets, hand-carved toys, and endless advice from every woman who had ever given birth. "Mrs. Henderson told me I should eat nothing but bland food for 9 months, Judith reported one evening with amusement. "Mrs. Chen says I need to eat spicy food to make a strong baby, and Elizabeth Harper insists I should take long walks every day." "What do you think you should do?" Jonas asked. He was rubbing her feet, which had started swelling in the heat. "I think I should eat what sounds good. Rest when I am tired and not worry too much," Judith said. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I will figure it out." "You will," Jonas agreed. "You are the strongest person I know." As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Judith's belly swelled round and obvious. She had to adjust her dresses, letting out seams and adding panels, and eventually Jonas fashioned her a comfortable chair with extra cushions where she could sit behind the counter when her back ached. "I feel like a whale," Judith grumbled one afternoon. "You look beautiful," Jonas said loyally. "You have to say that. You are my husband." "I say it because it is true." He knelt beside her chair, his hand splaying over her swollen belly. "You are carrying our child. That makes you the most beautiful thing in the world." As if in response to his voice, the baby kicked hard enough that Jonas felt it. His expression of wonder made Judith laugh despite her discomfort. "That is our son or daughter," she said softly, "letting you know they are in there." "Strong," Jonas said approvingly. "Takes after the mother." The baby came on a cold night in late October, 2 weeks earlier than they had expected. Judith's water broke while she was doing inventory, soaking through her skirts in an embarrassing rush. She stood there for a moment in shock, then the first contraction hit, and she gasped. Jonas was at her side instantly. "What do I do?" he demanded, looking almost panicked. It was the first time Judith had ever seen him truly rattled. "Get Elizabeth Harper and Mrs. Chen," Judith managed, "and the midwife, Mrs. Abernathy. They will know what to do." Jonas ran. Judith had never seen him move so fast. Within 20 minutes, her bedroom was full of capable women who ushered Jonas out despite his protests and proceeded to help Judith through the long night of labor. It was harder than she had expected. The pain came in waves that left her gasping and crying out, and between contractions she could hear Jonas pacing outside the door, his footsteps heavy with worry. Mrs. Abernathy, a stern woman who had delivered half the babies in Silver Ridge, was relentlessly efficient, checking Judith's progress and offering terse encouragements. "You're doing fine," she said. "First babies take time. Just keep breathing." Hours blurred together. Judith lost track of time, lost track of everything except the pain and the need to push when Mrs. Abernathy finally told her to. She heard someone screaming and realized dimly that it was her own voice, and then there was tremendous pressure and release, and the thin, angry cry of a newborn. "It is a boy," Mrs. Abernathy announced, and placed a squalling, blood-streaked infant on Judith's chest. A healthy boy. Judith looked down at her son through tears and fell instantly, irrevocably, in love. He was red-faced and furious, his tiny fists waving, and he was the most perfect thing she had ever seen. "Let the father in," she heard herself say. The door opened, and Jonas came in like he had been launched from a cannon. He stopped short at the sight of Judith holding the baby, his face cycling through about a dozen emotions in the space of seconds. "Come meet your son," Judith said softly. Jonas approached like he was in a dream, his eyes locked on the baby. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, and Judith shifted so he could see the baby's face. "He's so small," Jonas breathed. "He is perfect," Judith corrected, "just like his father." Jonas made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob and carefully, so carefully, touched the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers curled around Jonas's much larger finger reflexively, and Jonas looked like he had been struck by lightning. "He is holding my hand," Jonas said, wonder in his voice. "He knows his papa," Judith said. They named him Thomas, after Judith's uncle, with Jonas as the middle name. Thomas Jonas Crow, born October 28, 1877, weighing 7 pounds and measuring 20 inches long, with a shock of dark hair and gray eyes that would eventually turn green like his mother's. Jonas was besotted from the first moment. Judith had worried that he might be uncomfortable with such a tiny, fragile creature, but she had underestimated him. Jonas took to fatherhood like he had been born for it, changing diapers without complaint, walking the floor with Thomas at all hours when the baby was fussy, and singing lullabies in his deep, rumbling voice that put the baby to sleep almost instantly. "You are a natural at this," Judith said one night, watching Jonas cradle their son. "He is easy to love," Jonas replied, "like his mother." The first year of Thomas's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and small miracles. First smile, first laugh, first tooth. Jonas' baby proofed their living quarters with a thoroughness that would have been amusing if it had not been so touching, patting every sharp corner and making sure nothing dangerous was within reach of curious little hands. The store continued to thrive. Judith managed to run the business with Thomas strapped to her in a carrier that Mrs. Chen showed her how to make, and customers cooed over the baby while Jonas handled the heavy lifting. They had become an institution in Silver Ridge, the Crows in their store, and Judith felt a deep satisfaction in what they had built together. Thomas's first word was "Papa," which pleased Jonas enormously and made Judith laugh. His second word was "Mama," and his third was "Horse," because Jonas had started taking him to the stable to see the animals, and Thomas was fascinated. "He's going to be a mountain man like you," Judith said, watching her son toddle around the workroom, examining everything with serious concentration. "Or a shopkeeper like you," Jonas countered, "or something entirely his own." "As long as he is happy," Judith said. "He will be," Jonas said with certainty. "With you as his mother, how could he be anything else?" When Thomas was 18 months old, Judith realized she was pregnant again. This time the realization came with less surprise and more weary acceptance. She loved Thomas fiercely, but the exhaustion of caring for a toddler while running a business had taken its toll. "Are you happy?" Jonas asked when she told him. He was watching her face carefully, reading her expression. "Yes," Judith said, and found that it was true. "Tired, but happy, are you?" "Ecstatic," Jonas said. He pulled her close, careful of her stomach where a new life was beginning. "Our family is growing." The second pregnancy was harder than the first. Judith was more tired, and chasing after Thomas left her with little time to rest. Jonas took on even more of the burden, handling most of the store work while Judith minded Thomas and tried not to be sick. "I do not remember being this exhausted with Thomas," Judith said one afternoon, collapsed on the sofa while Thomas napped. "You are doing more this time," Jonas pointed out, "and you are older." "I am 24, Judith protested, "not ancient." "I did not say ancient." Jonas sat beside her, lifting her feet into his lap to rub them. "I just meant you have more to manage now. Let me help more." "You already do everything," Judith said. "Then I will do more than everything," Jonas said firmly. "You are carrying our child. That is the hard part. Let me handle the rest." The baby came in early spring, another boy they named Samuel, after the old prospector who had become like family to them. Samuel Crow was smaller than Thomas had been, only 6 pounds, and he came into the world quietly, barely crying, his dark eyes solemn and watchful. "He is thinking deep thoughts already," Jonas said, holding his new son with the same wonder he had shown with Thomas. "He is figuring out the world," Judith said. She was tired to her bones but happy, watching her husband cradle their second son. Thomas was with Mrs. Chen for the day, probably being thoroughly spoiled, and for this brief moment, it was just the 3 of them. "Thank you," Jonas said softly, looking at Judith with so much love it hurt. "For what?" "For this. For our family. For loving me. For giving me a life I never thought I could have." "Jonas Crow, I would give you the world if I could," Judith said, "but since I cannot manage that, I will give you our sons and my heart and every day of my life." "That is more than the world," Jonas said. "That is everything." The years flowed past like the creek running through Silver Ridge, constant and steady. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses and spent hours following his father around, asking endless questions about tracking and trapping and mountain lore. Samuel was quieter, but equally curious, with a talent for working with his hands that showed up early. By the time he was 4, he was carving wooden animals with a knife Jonas had made safe for small hands. Judith and Jonas settled into their life together with a comfort that came from deep compatibility. They still ran the store, though they had hired help as the business grew. A young man named Peter, who handled deliveries and heavy work, and a widow named Mrs. Sullivan, who helped with the accounts and minded the store when Judith needed to focus on the children. Jonas still went to the mountains, but rarely for more than a few days at a time. His trap lines were smaller now, maintained more as a connection to his past life than as a primary source of income. The store and the fur trading business provided well, and Jonas's reputation as a guide had led to summer work taking wealthy Easterners into the high country to hunt and fish. "I am thinking of expanding," Judith said one evening. They were in bed, that quiet time after the children were asleep when they could finally talk without interruption. "Adding a section for household goods, maybe some ready-made dresses from Denver." "Sounds good," Jonas said. He was playing with her hair, running the auburn strands through his fingers. "Whatever you think is best." "I also think we need a bigger house," Judith continued. "The boys are getting older. They need more space." "I've been thinking about that too," Jonas admitted. "There is a plot of land at the edge of town where the forest starts, close enough to be convenient, but far enough for some privacy. We could build something there, big enough for the store and for our family." "That would be perfect," Judith said. She rolled over to face him, studying the face she knew as well as her own. Jonas was 37 now, his beard thoroughly gray, though his hair was still mostly dark. The years had added lines around his eyes and a few more scars from his work in the mountains. But to her, he was as handsome as the day he had walked into her store bleeding and introduced himself twice. "What are you thinking?" Jonas asked, catching her looking. "That I love you," Judith said simply. "That I am grateful for every day we have had together." "We will have many more," Jonas said. "I plan to grow old with you, Judith Crow." "Good," Judith said and kissed him, "because I plan to grow old with you too." They built the house that summer, a sprawling structure of logs and stone that bridged the gap between Jonas's mountain heritage and the practical needs of a growing family. It had a large workroom for processing furs and a separate building for the expanded store, along with a comfortable living space with enough bedrooms for the children and guests, plus a room that could serve as an office for Judith. Moving in felt like stepping into a new chapter. Thomas was 7 and Samuel was 5, and they ran through the new house with wild excitement, claiming bedrooms and exploring the surrounding forest under Jonas's watchful eye. "This is ours," Jonas said that first night, standing with Judith on the wide front porch. The sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "We built this together." "We did," Judith agreed, leaning into his solid warmth, "and it is perfect." The years continued their steady march. Thomas turned 10, then 12, growing tall and lean like his father, but with his mother's green eyes and quick mind. He became invaluable help at the store, good with customers and meticulous with the accounts. Samuel, quieter and more introspective, showed a talent for woodworking and started making furniture that Jonas sold for good prices to people in town and beyond. Judith turned 30, then 35. Her auburn hair gained threads of silver, and lines appeared around her eyes from years of squinting at ledgers and smiling at customers. She had become a respected figure in Silver Ridge, the woman you went to when you needed advice or help or just someone who would listen. Her store had grown into the largest mercantile in the territory, and she had a reputation for fair dealing that extended far beyond the town borders. Jonas aged too, but he seemed to grow more solid rather than weaker. At 45, he could still track through the mountains with the endurance of a much younger man, and his strength was legendary. But he was gentler now than he had been, the hard edges worn away by years of love and family. He was devoted to Judith and their sons, and everyone knew it. "You have gotten soft," old Samuel the prospector teased one day. He was in his 80s now, living in a small cabin behind the Crow house where he helped with odd jobs and kept an eye on things. "I have gotten happy," Jonas corrected. "There is a difference." "Suppose there is," Samuel agreed. "You are a lucky man, Jonas Crow." "I know," Jonas said, looking across the way to where Judith was hanging laundry, laughing at something one of the boys had said. "I know exactly how lucky I am." That summer, when Thomas was 16 and Samuel was 14, a gang of outlaws rode into Silver Ridge. They were led by a man named Garrett Black, wanted for robbery and murder across 3 territories, and they were looking for supplies and trouble, probably in that order. They came into the store in the late afternoon when Judith was working the counter and Jonas was in the back with a delivery. There were 5 of them, all armed, all dangerous looking. Garrett Black was a tall man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached them. "Afternoon, madam," he said, tipping his hat in a mockery of politeness. "We need supplies." "All right," Judith said calmly, though her heart was pounding. She had dealt with dangerous men before, but something about these 5 set every instinct on edge. "What do you need?" "Everything," Black said. "Food, ammunition, whiskey, and we will be paying with this." He laid a pistol on the counter with deliberate care. "I do not accept that currency," Judith said, her voice steady despite her fear. "You can pay with money or trade goods, but not threats." Black's smile widened. Bold words for a woman alone. "She is not alone," Jonas said from the doorway to the back room. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Jonas stood there with his arms loose at his sides, no weapon visible, but everything about his posture screamed danger. He looked like what he was, a man who had survived decades in the wilderness, who had fought and killed when necessary, who would protect what was his with absolute ruthlessness. The outlaws shifted nervously. They were all experienced men, and they recognized a threat when they saw one. "We do not want trouble," Black said, though his hand moved toward his gun. "Then leave," Jonas said flatly. "Now." There was a long, tense moment when it could have gone either way. Then Black apparently decided that whatever they might gain from robbing this store was not worth facing the mountain man. He picked up his pistol and nodded to his men. "We are going," he said, "but we will remember this." "So will I," Jonas said. The outlaws left. Jonas waited until they were out of sight, then went to Judith and pulled her into his arms. She was shaking now that the danger had passed, the adrenaline draining away and leaving her weak. "Are you all right?" Jonas asked. "I'm fine," Judith said. "Thanks to you." "We need to tell the sheriff," Jonas said. "Garrett Black is wanted. He should not be running loose." They reported the incident, and Sheriff Porter organized a posse that tracked the outlaws into the mountains. Jonas went with them, despite Judith's worry, because he was the best tracker they had. They caught up with the gang 3 days later in a canyon to the north. There was a brief, violent confrontation that left 2 outlaws dead, and the rest, including Garrett Black, captured. Jonas came home with a graze across his ribs and a haunted look that Judith recognized from the early days of their marriage. "It is over," she said, cleaning and bandaging the wound. "You did what you had to do." "I know," Jonas said, "but I'm getting too old for this, and I have too much to lose now." "Then do not do it again," Judith said. "Let younger men handle the outlaws. You have a family that needs you alive." Jonas pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. "You are right. I am done with that part of my life. From now on, I stick to the store and the trap lines and our family." "Good," Judith said, and kissed him, "because I need you here with me. We all do." Thomas was 17 when he announced he wanted to go to college back east. Judith and Jonas were sitting at the dinner table when he made his declaration, and for a moment, neither of them could speak. "College," Jonas finally said. "That is in places like Boston or New York." "Yes," Thomas said. He looked nervous but determined. "I want to study business and maybe law. I want to come back and help run the store, but I want to learn more first. Be more than just a shopkeeper in a mountain town." Judith felt a pang in her chest. Her eldest son leaving. It felt too soon, even though she knew intellectually that 17 was old enough, that young men had been leaving home at that age forever. "What do you think?" Jonas asked, looking at Judith. She took a breath, pushing down her immediate instinct to say no, to keep her son close and safe. "I think it is a wonderful idea," she said, and meant it. "You are smart enough to do well at any college that will take you, Thomas, and we can afford to send you." Thomas's face lit up. "Really? You mean it?" "We mean it," Jonas confirmed. "If this is what you want, we will support you." They sent Thomas to a business college in Chicago that fall. Saying goodbye at the stage stop was one of the hardest things Judith had ever done, watching her son ride away toward a future she could barely imagine. But Jonas held her hand and reminded her that they had raised Thomas to be independent and capable, and this was proof they had succeeded. Samuel, quieter and more content to stay close to home, continued his woodworking and began courting a girl named Hannah, the daughter of a rancher to the south. She was a sweet-faced girl with a practical nature that reminded Jonas of a young Judith, and Samuel was clearly smitten. "Do you think they will marry?" Judith asked Jonas one evening as they watched Samuel walk Hannah home in the twilight. "Eventually," Jonas said. "Samuel does not rush into anything, but yes, I think he will marry her when he is ready." "We are getting old," Judith said. It was not a complaint, just an observation. She was 40 years old now. Jonas was 50. Their children were grown, or nearly so. "We are getting older," Jonas corrected. "But I am not done with you yet, Judith Crow. We have years ahead of us." "Good," Judith said, leaning into his warmth, "because I am not done with you either." Thomas came home after 2 years with a degree and new ideas about inventory management and customer relations. He also brought news that he had met a woman, a teacher's daughter from Chicago named Margaret, who wanted to see the West. Could she come visit? "Of course," Judith said. "Any woman brave enough to want to see Montana is welcome here." Margaret arrived in the spring, a small blonde woman with sharp blue eyes and a determination that quickly won over the family. She and Thomas were clearly in love, and when he proposed at the end of her visit, no one was surprised that she said yes. They married in the summer of 1896, 20 years almost to the day after Jonas and Judith had married. The ceremony was in the same small church, though it had been expanded and improved over the years. Thomas was 21 and Margaret was 20, and they looked at each other with the same devotion that Jonas and Judith still shared. "That was us," Jonas murmured to Judith during the reception. "That is still us," Judith corrected. Samuel married Hannah a year later, and suddenly the house felt both fuller and emptier. Thomas and Margaret took over the day-to-day running of the store, with Judith's guidance, implementing new systems and expanding the mail order business. Samuel built a house on the ranch property where Hannah had grown up, and he and his father-in-law went into business raising horses. Judith and Jonas found themselves with time they had not had in years. The store ran smoothly without their constant supervision. The boys were settled and happy. They were, for the first time since Thomas was born, able to focus on each other. "What do you want to do?" Jonas asked one morning. They were sitting on the front porch with coffee, watching the sunrise over the mountains. It was early summer and the meadows were full of wildflowers. "I want to spend time with you," Judith said. "I want to read books and take walks and not worry about inventory or deliveries or anything practical." "That sounds perfect," Jonas said. They did exactly that. They took long walks into the foothills, Jonas pointing out plants and animal tracks and telling stories about his years alone in the mountains. They read books together in the evenings, sometimes aloud and sometimes in comfortable silence. They made love with the leisure of people who knew each other's bodies perfectly and had nowhere else to be. "I am happy," Judith said one night, lying in Jonas's arms in the darkness. "After everything, all the years and the struggles and the joys, I am so deeply happy." "So am I," Jonas said. He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You gave me a life, Judith. Before you, I was just existing, going through the motions. You made me live." "You did the same for me," Judith said. "I was so lonely before you came into my store that day. I did not even realize how lonely until you were there, and suddenly I was not alone anymore." "I almost did not come in," Jonas admitted. "I had passed through Silver Ridge before and never stopped. But that day, something pulled me. I needed bandages, but I could have gotten them anywhere. Something told me to go into that store specifically." "Fate," Judith said. "Love," Jonas corrected. "Even before I knew you, I was being pulled toward you." They lay there in the darkness, holding each other, grateful for every moment they had been given. The new century arrived with celebration and hope. Silver Ridge had grown into a proper town with electric lights and a telegraph office. The railroad had finally extended a line that came within 20 miles, making shipping and travel easier. The store, now run primarily by Thomas and Margaret, was more successful than ever. Jonas was 56 years old and still strong, though he moved a bit slower than he once had. His hair was fully gray now, his beard white, but his gray eyes were as sharp as ever. Judith was 46, her auburn hair streaked with silver, laugh lines deep around her eyes and mouth. She had become a grandmother twice over Thomas, and Margaret had a daughter named Rose, and Samuel and Hannah had a son called James. "We are old," Judith said one day, watching Jonas play with his grandchildren in the yard. He was down on all fours, pretending to be a bear, while Rose shrieked with delighted terror, and James toddled after him. "We are exactly the right age," Jonas said later when she told him what she had been thinking. "Old enough to have lived full lives, young enough to have time left to enjoy what we built." "How much time do you think we have?" Judith asked. It was the kind of question they had avoided when they were younger, but now it felt important to acknowledge. "Years," Jonas said firmly. "Many years. I plan to see those grandchildren grown. I plan to hold our great-grandchildren if we are lucky enough to have them. And I plan to love you every single day until my last breath." "Promise?" Judith asked, her voice soft. "Promise," Jonas said, and sealed it with a kiss. They kept that promise to each other. Through their 50s and into their 60s, Jonas and Judith Crow remained devoted to each other and to the family they had built. More grandchildren came. Thomas and Margaret had 3 more children, and Samuel and Hannah had 2 more. The house was full of noise and laughter when the family gathered, 3 generations sharing meals and stories. The store continued to thrive under Thomas's management. He had expanded into catalog sales and had even opened a second location in Coppertown. Samuel's horse breeding operation had gained a reputation across the territory for producing quality animals. Both sons credited their success to the example their parents had set, the lessons of hard work and integrity and treating people fairly. "You did good," old Samuel the prospector said one day. He was 96 years old now, somehow still alive and cantankerous. "Those boys of yours are good men. Your grandchildren are growing up right. You and Jonas built something that will last." "We tried," Judith said. She was 62 years old, and her joints ached on cold mornings, but her mind was still sharp and her heart still full. "Did more than try," Samuel said. "You succeeded." Jonas celebrated his 70th birthday with a gathering of family and friends that seemed to include half the town. He was still strong despite his age, though he no longer went into the high country. His hair and beard were pure white now, his face deeply lined, but his gray eyes were as clear as ever when he looked at Judith. 70 years, he said that night when they were alone. "I never thought I would live this long. Never thought I would want to." "And now?" Judith asked. "Now I want more," Jonas said. "More time with you, more time with our family. I'm greedy for every moment." "So am I," Judith said. They made it to their golden anniversary, 50 years of marriage, in the summer of 1926. The celebration was enormous, organized by Thomas and Margaret with help from Samuel and Hannah and all the grandchildren. People came from across the state, some of them having traveled for days to be there. Judith wore a dress of cream-colored silk that Margaret had ordered special from Seattle, and Jonas wore a new suit that he grumbled was too fancy but secretly loved. They renewed their vows in the church, the same church where they had married 5 decades before, and there was not a dry eye in the congregation when Jonas looked at Judith and said, "I would choose you again in every lifetime." At the reception, their grandson James, now a strapping young man of 24, made a toast. "To my grandparents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us all what love looks like, may we all be lucky enough to find what you found." "What we built," Jonas corrected gently. "Love is not just found. It is built day by day, choice by choice, through the good times and the hard times. We chose each other every day for 50 years. And I will keep choosing you," Judith added, taking his hand. The party went on long into the night, but eventually Jonas and Judith slipped away to their bedroom. They were old now, their bodies marked by the passage of time, but when Jonas took Judith in his arms, they were 22 and 30 again, new to each other and full of wonder. "I love you," Jonas said. "I loved you from that first day when you stitched me up, and then I introduced myself twice like a fool, and you laughed." "I love you too," Judith said. "That laugh was when I knew, when you blushed because you had forgotten, and you looked so human despite being this enormous, dangerous mountain man. That was when I was done for." They made love that night with the tenderness of long practice and deep knowledge. And afterward, they lay entwined in the darkness, grateful for every moment they had been given and hopeful for the moments still to come. Jonas passed away peacefully in his sleep 2 years later, at the age of 72. Judith woke one morning to find him still and cold beside her, his face peaceful, one hand still reaching toward her across the bed. The grief was enormous, a physical pain that left her gasping, but underneath it was gratitude. They had been given 52 years together. They had built a life, a family, a legacy. He had loved her until his last breath, just as he had promised. The funeral was the largest Silver Ridge had ever seen. Jonas had been a fixture of the community for over half a century, and people came from hundreds of miles to pay their respects. But Judith barely saw them. She stood at the graveside with her sons on either side of her, watching as they lowered the casket into the ground, and she felt like half of herself was being buried with him. "He loved you so much," Thomas said quietly. "I know," Judith said, "and I loved him. I still love him." She continued on because she had to, because she had family who needed her and a legacy to protect. But the light had gone out of the world with Jonas's passing. She moved through her days mechanically, running on habit and duty. 3 months after Jonas died, Judith woke in the night with a sharp pain in her chest. She knew immediately what it was. Her heart, broken by grief, was giving out. She thought about calling for help, but then she thought about Jonas, about the promise he had made to love her until his last breath. She was ready to make the same promise. Judith Brennan Crow passed away peacefully in the same bed where she had slept with her husband for 50 years, a smile on her face, her hand stretched across the empty space beside her. She was 78 years old. They buried her next to Jonas, and the marker read, "Together in life, together in eternity." Thomas and Margaret took over the house, raising their youngest children there and welcoming grandchildren of their own. Samuel and Hannah continued the horse ranch, and their children grew up learning the value of hard work and integrity. The store remained in the family, passed down through generations, and people still talked about the Crows, about Jonas and Judith and the love story that had become legend. Years later, Thomas's great-granddaughter asked him about his grandparents, wanting to know if the stories were true. Were they really so in love? Did it really last 50 years? Thomas, an old man himself by then, smiled. "It was real," he said. "More real than anything I've ever known. My grandfather was the strongest man I ever met, and my grandmother was the bravest woman. But when they were together, They were just Jonas and Judith, two people who loved each other more than anything else in the world. How did they meet? The girl asked. He walked into her store bleeding and introduced himself, Thomas said. Then he forgot and introduced himself again, and she laughed. Grandpa always said that was the moment he knew. That laugh, that was when he was done for. And they really loved each other until the end? Until the end and beyond, Thomas confirmed. Some loves are like that. They do not end just because life does. They echo forward, touching everyone who comes after. My grandparents' love shaped our entire family, made us who we are. That is the kind of love worth having. The girl thought about that, and then she smiled. I want that someday. Then find it, Thomas said, and when you do, choose it every day the way they did. That is the secret. Love is not just a feeling, it is a choice, made over and over through the good and the bad until your last breath and beyond. In the cemetery at the edge of Silver Ridge, two headstones stood side by side under a pine tree, weathered by time but still legible. Jonas Crow and Judith Brennan Crow, mountain man and shopkeeper, husband and wife, two people who had found each other in the wild frontier and built a love that lasted generations. And in the mountains above the town, in the high country where Jonas had once run trap lines and lived alone, sometimes on quiet mornings when the mist rose from the valleys, people said you could hear laughter on the wind, bright and joyful and eternal.